The water was back under the November sky. Along the Oxfordshire Canal, where the towpath narrowed between bramble and stone, the fog had settled thick as wool, muffling the world beyond 10 paces. It was the 7th of November 1908, and the bargemen had seen nothing unusual that morning, only the usual traffic of coal and grain moving slowly southward toward Oxford, the horses plodding in their eternal rhythm, breath steaming in the cold air. By noon the mist had lifted enough to reveal the skeletal trees along the bank, their branches bare and still. It was then that someone noticed the abandoned bicycle, its front wheel half submerged in the shallows near Kidlington Lock, the handlebars twisted at an unnatural angle. The leather satchel lay nearby, sodden and heavy, its contents bleeding ink into the mud. Inside were letters addressed to a woman who would never read them, and a return ticket to London dated for that very evening. The canal keeper stood at the water's edge, calling out a name that echoed and died in the stillness. No answer came, only the slow movement of the water, dark and patient, carrying its secrets toward the Thames. The search would begin within hours, but the canal had already claimed what it would not release. And in the lengthening shadows of that November afternoon, the mystery of what happened along that desolate stretch of towpath began to settle into the bones of Oxfordshire like winter frost, waiting. Chapter 1. The Towpath in Twilight. Good evening and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small around you. Wherever you are listening, perhaps beneath warm blankets as the day releases its hold, or in the gentle hours when sleep begins its slow approach, we are grateful you have found your way here. Tell us, where are you listening from tonight? What hour marks your clock as we prepare to step backward through time? If this is your first visit to these dark chronicles, or if you have returned to walk once more through history's shadowed corridors, please subscribe to our channel. Let us be your companion in the stillness, your guide through the forgotten hours. And now, as the modern world recedes and the past draws near, let us drift toward the waterways of Edwardian England, where the mist held secrets and the canals ran black and deep. The Oxfordshire Canal in the autumn of 1908 was a world unto itself, a ribbon of dark water cutting through the heart of Middle England with the patience of centuries. From Banbury in the north to Oxford in the south, it threaded through 43 miles of countryside that had changed little since the canal's completion more than 100 years before. The waterway had been built in an age of ambition, when the Industrial Revolution demanded arteries of commerce to carry coal and grain and iron across a nation transforming itself. But by the early years of the 20th century, the canal had settled into a quieter existence. The great railways had claimed the faster traffic, leaving the waterway to the bargemen and their families, to the narrow boats that moved at walking pace behind patient horses, to the lock keepers who lived in stone cottages beside the water and knew every bend and weir as intimately as the lines upon their own hands. The canal banks in November wore the colours of dying. The willows and alders that lined the towpath had shed their leaves, leaving skeletal branches to claw at the grey sky. The water itself ran sluggish and dark, reflecting nothing but the overcast heavens and the occasional flight of waterfowl moving south before winter's approach. Mist rose from the surface in the early mornings and lingered through the short days, never quite burning away before dusk arrived to claim the world again. The towpath, that narrow track where horses pulled their loads and where solitary travellers might walk between villages, was a place of mud and isolation. In places it widened enough for two people to pass without discomfort. In others it narrowed to little more than a ledge between water and bramble, forcing even the most confident walker to tread with care. The villages that the canal passed through, or near, were small and ancient. Kidlington, Thrupp, Shipton-on-Cherwell, settlements that had existed since Domesday and before, their churches Norman, their public houses Tudor, their rhythms agricultural and unchanging. The coming of the canal had brought some commerce, some traffic of strangers, but these places remained fundamentally apart from the great rush of modern life. A man might walk from Banbury to Oxford along the towpath and encounter more bargemen than villagers, more sonnets than conversation. The waterway belonged to those who worked it, and to those who sought solitude or escape from the crowded towns. The locks themselves were engineering marvels of an earlier age, great chambers of stone and timber where the water could be raised or lowered to accommodate the gradual descent from the northern highlands toward the Thames Valley. Each lock had its keeper, usually a man who lived with his family in a cottage beside the mechanism, responsible for opening and closing the great wooden gates, for maintaining the paddle gear, and ensuring the smooth passage of canal traffic. These men knew the waterway with an intimacy that bordered on the mystical. They could read the current, sense the depth, predict where the ice would form in winter and where the weed would choke in summer. They saw everyone who passed, noted every boat and every solitary walker, became the unofficial chroniclers of the canal's daily life. But for all this human presence, the canal remained a place where disappearance was possible. The water was deep in places, 12 feet or more where the channel had been dredged to accommodate the laden boats. The banks in many stretches were overgrown with hawthorn and blackthorn, creating screens of vegetation that could hide anything from view. The towpath, especially in fog or failing light, became a place of uncertain footing, where the edge of the land met the edge of the water without clear demarcation, where a moment's inattention might send a person into the cold embrace of the canal. And in those reaches between villages and locks, where the waterway curved through empty countryside, a man might walk for an hour without seeing another living soul. The year 1908 was late Edwardian England, a time that felt itself modern yet retained the structures and certainties of Victoria's long reign. King Edward VII sat upon the throne, though his health was failing. The nation was at peace, though tensions with Germany grew like shadows at the edge of consciousness. In the cities, electric lights and motor cars were transforming daily life, but here along the canal, change moved at the pace of water. The bargemen still used horses. The lock keepers still lit oil lamps at dusk. The rhythm of the seasons and the demands of agriculture still governed the countryside more surely than any government in distant London. It was a world where a man's reputation mattered, where character was known and gossiped about in public houses and market squares, where a stranger was noted and discussed. Yet it was also a world where privacy could still be maintained, where a person's business remained largely their own if they chose to keep it so. The canal existed in both spheres, public in that everyone who used it was visible to the lockkeepers and bargemen, yet private in that long stretches of towpath offered complete solitude. A man walking alone would be seen at the locks, but invisible between them, known to have passed but unobserved in his actual passage. The November light along the canal was perpetually failing. Dawn came late and grey, never quite achieving brightness before the long decline toward afternoon. By 4 o'clock the dusk was gathering. By 5 it was full dark, the kind of darkness that the 20th century was beginning to forget in its cities, but which still held absolute dominion over the countryside. On the canal at night, with no moon and the mist rising, a man with a lantern could see perhaps 20 feet ahead. Beyond that, nothing. The water made small sounds, the lap against the bank, the movement of some night creature, the distant splash of a fish or rat. But mostly there was silence, the profound quiet of a world without engines or electricity, where sound travelled far and clear, but where most of the night remained wrapped in its own hush. The people who lived and worked along the canal were a particular breed. The bargemen were often families who had known no other life, born on the narrow boats, raised in the 70-foot worlds of painted wood and brass fittings, moving eternally between the northern coalfields and the southern markets. They were clannish, suspicious of outsiders, yet bound by their own codes of mutual assistance. If a boat needed help through a difficult lock, help was given. If a family fell on hard times, the community supported its own. But they were also hard people, made so by the demands of their trade. The work was physical and unending. The living conditions were cramped and cold. Children grew up quickly or not at all. The lockkeepers were more settled. rooted to their particular stretch of canal, but no less shaped by the waterway's demands. They rose before dawn to accommodate the early traffic and worked until dark. Their cottages were small and damp, heated by coal fires that filled the rooms with smoke on still days. Their wives often kept chickens and small gardens, supplementing their meagre income with eggs and vegetables. Their children played along the banks and learned to swim in the canal's dark water, developing a respect for its dangers that bordered on fear. These families knew the canal's moods, when it rose dangerously after heavy rain, when it froze solid enough to walk upon, when it revealed the bodies of drowned animals, or, more rarely, drowned people. For the canal did claim lives. Accidents were not uncommon. A bargeman might slip on a wet gunwale and vanish beneath his own boat. A child playing too near the edge might fall in and be swept away before help could arrive. A drunk walking home along the towpath might miss his footing in the dark. The canal kept these dead, sometimes releasing them days or weeks later, sometimes never. The water was cold, and the current, though seemingly sluggish, possessed surprising strength in places. Bodies could be caught beneath submerged debris held in underwater hollows, or carried miles from where they had entered. The canal had taken its toll since the first water had been let into the cuts, and it would continue to take its toll as long as the water flowed. But death by misadventure, while tragic, was understood. The canal was a working place, a place of legitimate danger where caution was required and where carelessness was sometimes punished fatally. What was less understood, what caused unease among those who knew the waterway well, were the disappearances that seemed to have no natural explanation. The times when someone was seen entering a particular stretch of towpath but never emerged from the other end. The occasions when belongings were found but no body recovered. The mysteries that the water seemed to swallow entirely, leaving no trace, no explanation, no closure for those who waited. The Oxfordshire Canal in November 1908 was such a place, beautiful in its melancholy way, essential to the commerce and life of the region, yet possessed of a darkness that was more than the absence of light. It was a threshold between the known world of village and farm, and something older, something that had existed before the canal was dug, but which the water had somehow concentrated and preserved. The mist that rose from the surface carried the smell of deep earth and decay. The willows along the bank moved in wind that could not be felt. And sometimes, in the hour between dog and wolf when day surrendered to night, the towpath seemed to belong not to England at all, but to some border country where the rules were different, and where a man might step from the known into the unknowable, without ever realizing he'd crossed that invisible line. This was the world into which a man would vanish on the 7th of November, leaving behind only questions and a bicycle half-submerged in black water. Canal waited, patient and dark, keeping its secrets as it had always kept them, flowing slowly southward through the dying autumn toward the winter that would freeze its surface and silence its flow. And along the towpath where the mist gathered thick as memory, the place itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the story that was about to unfold in its cold embrace. Chapter 2. The Man Who Vanished. His name was Thomas Weldon, and he was 34 years old in the autumn of 1908. He had been born in Oxford, the son of a printer whose shop stood in a narrow lane off the High Street, one of those establishments that had served the university and the town for generations, producing everything from academic treatises to funeral cards. Thomas had learned the trade as a boy, standing at his father's elbow in the workshop that smelled of ink and paper and machine oil, mastering the compositor's art of setting type letter by letter, learning to read backwards as easily as forwards, developing the steady hands and patient temperament that the work required. By the time he reached manhood, he was as skilled as his father, perhaps more so, with an eye for layout and an instinct for the rhythm of text that made him valuable to the business. But the printing trade in Oxford was changing. The old ways, the handset type and the manual presses, were giving way to newer machines, faster processes, cheaper methods. The large printing houses in London could produce work at a fraction of the cost, and even the university printers were modernising, investing in equipment that required fewer skilled men. Thomas found himself caught between two worlds. too traditional in his methods to secure work with the new establishments, too young to have built the kind of reputation that would sustain an independent workshop. When his father died in the winter of 1907, the shop passed to Thomas, along with its debts and its dwindling list of clients. He had struggled through the spring and summer of 1908, taking whatever work came, but by autumn it was clear that the business could not continue. He was not a man given to despair, those who knew him said. He was quiet, methodical, reliable in the way that craftsmen of his generation were expected to be reliable. He attended St. Mary's Church most Sundays, though he was not conspicuously devout. He belonged to no clubs or societies. He drank moderately and gambled not at all. His pleasures were simple: long walks in the countryside, the occasional music hall performance, books borrowed from the lending library. He had never married, though there had been some talk years before of an understanding with a draper's daughter that had come to nothing. By 1908 he lived alone in the rooms above the print shop, keeping house for himself with the same quiet competence he brought to his work. In October of that year he had received a letter from London. It came from a printing firm in Clerkenwell, a respectable establishment that specialised in legal documents and commercial stationery. They had heard of his skills through some connection Thomas never quite understood, and they were prepared to offer him a position as a senior compositor at wages that exceeded what he had been earning in Oxford. The offer was genuine and generous. It would mean leaving Oxford, abandoning the shop that had been his father's and his grandfather's before that, starting over in the great city to where he knew no one and possessed no connections. But it would also mean security, steady employment, the possibility of a future beyond the slow death of the Oxford business. Thomas had written back accepting the position. He would begin on the 1st of December. That gave him November to settle his affairs, to dispose of the print shop and its contents, to say his farewells to the few people in Oxford who would mark his leaving. He went about these tasks with his characteristic thoroughness. He sold what equipment he could and arranged for the rest to be auctioned. He gave notice to his landlord for the end of November. He packed his personal belongings, mostly books and clothes, into 2 trunks that would be sent ahead to London. He visited the bank to close his accounts and draw out the small sum that remained after settling his debts. Everything was in order. Everything was arranged. He was a man preparing for a new beginning, not an ending. On the 6th of November, he had travelled north to Banbury by train. The purpose of this journey was never entirely clear, though later there would be much speculation. He had told his landlord he would be away for a day or two, visiting an aunt who lived in the Banbury area. There was indeed such an aunt, his late mother's sister, a widow who kept a small house on the edge of town. But when investigators later spoke with her, she said Thomas had not visited, had sent no word of his coming, and she had not seen him in more than a year. Where he spent the night of the 6th was never determined. No hotel or lodging house in Banbury had any record of a Thomas Weldon. No one in the town remembered seeing him. What is known with certainty is that on the morning of the 7th of November, Thomas Weldon was observed at the southern end of Banbury, near where the canal ran through the edge of town. A coal merchant who kept a yard near the waterway remembered seeing a man matching Thomas's description. Medium height, dark coat, bowler hat, standing on the canal bridge looking down at the water. The time was approximately 8:30. The morning was cold and the mist was thick, but the coal merchant was sure of what he had seen. The man had stood there for several minutes, quite still, as if studying something in the water or simply lost in thought. Then he had descended from the bridge and disappeared in the direction of the towpath heading south. The next confirmed sighting came at Nelbridge Lock, some 3 miles south of Banbury. The lockkeeper, a man named Arthur Hebden, who had worked that stretch of canal for 18 years, remembered a gentleman passing through around 10 o'clock in the morning. The gentleman had been walking south along the towpath, carrying no bag or parcel, moving at a steady pace. He had bid Hebden good morning as he passed. Hebden had noticed that the man seemed preoccupied, that he had not paused to watch the boat that was just then coming through the lock, which was unusual because most walkers stopped to observe the operation of the gates and the rising or falling of the great chamber. The man had simply walked on, following the towpath as it curved away through the mist. After Nelbridge Lock, the sightings became less certain. A bargeman thought he might have passed someone on the towpath near Ainhoe Weir, but the mist had been too thick to see clearly, and he could not be sure. A woman walking to market in Somerton believed she had seen a figure ahead of her on the path, but when she rounded the bend where the figure should have been, there was no one. These were the uncertain testimonies of people going about their daily business, paying little attention to a solitary walker who seemed of no particular significance. The canal carried such traffic regularly. A man walking alone was unremarkable. Only later would these glimpses take on the weight of evidence, become the last threads connecting Thomas Weldon to the world of the living. He had been carrying a bicycle. This fact was established later, though none of the witnesses who saw him walking had mentioned it. But Thomas owned a bicycle, a Raleigh model purchased 2 years earlier, well maintained and fitted with a leather satchel that strapped to the frame. The bicycle had been kept in the print shop in Oxford, and it was not there when the landlord entered the premises after Thomas disappeared. The assumption, never quite proven but never disproved, was that Thomas had taken the bicycle with him to Banbury, perhaps on the train, and had been riding it at some point during his journey south along the canal. Whether he had been riding it when the witnesses saw him walking, or whether he had been walking and wheeling the bicycle beside him, or whether he had left it somewhere and was walking without it, remained unclear. The bicycle would be found, but not Thomas. In his satchel, when it was recovered, were several items that told a partial story. There were letters, 3 of them, addressed to a Mrs. Catherine Ashford at an address in Bloomsbury, London. The letters were in Thomas's handwriting, though their contents were never made public. There was a return train ticket from Banbury to Oxford, dated for the 7th of November, valid for departure on the evening service. There was a small leather purse containing £2 and 7 shillings. There was a folded copy of the Times from the 6th of November. There was a map of the Oxfordshire Canal marked in pencil at several points between Banbury and Oxford. And there was a notebook, water-damaged but partially legible, containing what appeared to be accounts and calculations related to the print shop business. Thomas had worn a dark wool coat over a grey suit. He had worn a bowler hat and leather gloves. He had carried a pocket watch that had belonged to his father, silver-cased and engraved with his father's initials. He had worn good boots, recently repaired. He had been, by all accounts, dressed for travel, but not for any activity that would explain what happened to him along the canal. He had not been dressed for swimming or for working near the water. He had not appeared distressed or unwell. He had simply been a man walking south along a towpath on a November morning, a man who should have reached Oxford by evening, and who instead vanished as completely as if the earth had opened and swallowed him whole. The question of why he had been walking at all exercised investigators later. He had a return ticket for the train. The service from Banbury to Oxford ran regularly throughout the day. The journey by rail took less than an hour. The walk along the canal towpath would take the better part of a day, perhaps 8 or 9 hours at a steady pace longer, if he stopped to rest. It was November, cold and misty, hardly the season for recreational rambling. Yet Thomas had chosen to walk, or had found himself compelled to walk, or had intended to ride the bicycle and then for some reason abandoned that plan. No explanation was ever found among his papers or in the memories of those who knew him. He had simply set out along the towpath and proceeded south into the mist. There was no evidence of desperation in his recent behaviour. He had not been drinking heavily or spending recklessly. He had not spoken of any troubles beyond the ordinary difficulties of closing his business. He had accepted the London position and seemed, by all accounts, to be looking forward to the change. The letters in his satchel addressed to Mrs. Ashford in Bloomsbury suggested some connection to London, some reason to be writing to someone there, though the nature of that connection would become another mystery within the larger mystery. Thomas Weldon had not been a man running from anything. He had been a man walking towards something, toward a new life in London, towards some purpose in Banbury that remained forever obscure. And somewhere along the canal between Knellbridge Lock and Kidlington, he had ceased to exist in any form that could be found or understood. The last certain moment of his life was that sighting at Knellbridge Lock, Arthur Hebden watching him walk away into the mist. After that, nothing. Only the bicycle and the satchel and the black water waiting to give up its secrets or keep them forever in its cold depths. Thomas Weldon became, in that moment of vanishing, less a man than a question. a puzzle that would haunt the canal and the memories of those who searched for him long after the mist had lifted and November had given way to the frozen silence of December. Chapter 3. The Discovery at Kidlington Lock. The bicycle was found at 20 minutes past noon on the 7th of November by a boy named William Tasker, who was walking the towpath with his dog. William was 12 years old, the son of a farm labourer who worked land near Kidlington, and he knew the canal as well as any child raised beside it. He had been sent out that morning to check on sheep in a field that bordered the waterway, and he had brought the dog along, a rough-haired terrier that ranged ahead along the path, nose to the ground, investigating every scent and shadow. The mist was still thick in places, though the morning had warmed enough that patches of clearer air had begun to open between the banks. It was in one of these clearer stretches just north of Kidlington Lock where the towpath widened slightly and a small stand of willows grew close to the water's edge that the dog had begun barking. William had run up to find the animal standing at the very edge of the canal, hackles raised, barking at something in the shallows. At first he thought it might be a dead sheep or a drowned dog, something the canal had claimed and then released. But when he looked more carefully, he saw it was a bicycle, its front wheel submerged, the handlebars twisted sideways and caught in the roots of one of the willows. The metal frame gleamed dully where it emerged from the water. The rear wheel was still on the bank, barely, as if the bicycle had been pushed or had rolled into the canal and come to rest half in and half out. William knew at once that something was wrong. Bicycles did not simply roll into canals on their own. Someone had put it there, or someone had fallen with it, or some violence had occurred that had ended with the machine in the water. He had pulled the dog away and run immediately to Kidlington Lock, barely a quarter-mile south. The lockkeeper there was a man named George Pritchard, a stocky, bearded individual who had kept the lock for 7 years and who commanded respect among the canal community for his competence and his fair dealing. William found him at the lock cottage, eating his midday meal, and blurted out his discovery. Pritchard had set down his food at once and followed the boy back along the towpath to where the bicycle lay half-submerged. He studied it for several moments without touching it, noting the twisted handlebars, the position of the wheels, the way the frame had caught in the willow roots. Then he had waded into the shallows. The water was less than 2 feet deep at that point, and examined the bicycle more closely. It was a good machine, well maintained, not old. The leather satchel was still strapped to the frame, though it had taken on water and hung heavy and dark. Pritchard unbuckled it carefully and brought it to shore. The contents were sodden but intact. He spread them on the bank, the letters, the purse, the newspaper, the map, the notebook. The letters were addressed but unsealed. Pritchard, being a man of discretion, did not read them, but he noted the London address and the careful handwriting. The purse contained money, which eliminated theft as a motive for whatever had happened. The map was marked in several places, and one of those marks was very near to where they now stood. The notebook was too water-damaged to read immediately, though later, when it had dried, some of its contents would be deciphered. Pritchard sent William to Kidlington village to fetch the constable while he remained with the bicycle and its contents. He also sent word along the canal in both directions, using the network of lockkeepers and bargemen that could relay information faster than any official messenger. Within an hour, bargemen north and south of Kidlington had been alerted to watch for anything unusual, any sign of a man in the water or on the banks. The constable arrived by early afternoon, a young man named Davies, who had only recently taken up his post and who seemed overwhelmed by the situation. He examined the bicycle and the satchel contents, made notes in a small book, and then stood helplessly on the towpath trying to decide what should be done next. George Pritchard made the decision for him. The canal needed to be searched. If a man had gone into the water here, he might have been carried downstream by the current, such as it was, or he might be caught beneath the surface somewhere nearby. Pritchard knew every bargeman and lockkeeper for 10 miles in either direction. He sent word for them to gather at Kidlington Lock with grappling hooks and drag ropes. By mid-afternoon, a dozen men had assembled, grim-faced and silent, preparing for the work that everyone understood would likely end in the recovery of a body. The canal had yielded its dead before. It would do so again. They began dragging north of where the bicycle had been found, working methodically upstream. The method was ancient and effective. Long ropes weighted with hooks were dragged along the bottom of the canal, the men walking slowly along both banks, feeling for any obstruction that might be a submerged body. The water was perhaps 10 feet deep in the channel, shallower near the edges, and the bottom was thick with mud and weed and the accumulated debris of decades. The hooks snagged constantly on submerged branches, on old ropes, on the rusted remnants of long-discarded tools and equipment. Each snag required careful investigation, the rope drawn up slowly to see what had been caught. Most times it was nothing. Sometimes it was something that made the men look away, a drowned dog far gone in decay, the skeleton of a sheep, once the pale and bloated corpse of a pig that must have fallen from a farm cart weeks or months before. They worked until dark, covering perhaps half a mile of canal. They found no trace of a man. As night fell and the temperature dropped, Pritchard called a halt. The work would resume at first light the following morning. The men dispersed to their homes and boats, and Constable Davies returned to the village to send word to Oxford that a man appeared to have drowned in the canal near Kidlington, and that a search was underway. The bicycle and satchel were taken to the Lock Cottage for safekeeping. George Pritchard sat up late that night, examining the contents of the satchel again by lamplight, trying to understand who this man was and what had brought him to the canal. The letters provided some clues. They were written in a careful, educated hand. They addressed Mrs. Ashford with formal courtesy, but also with an undertone of familiarity that suggested some long-standing acquaintance. The content was largely practical: arrangements for lodging in London, mentions of the new position Thomas had accepted, requests for Mrs. Ashford's assistance in finding suitable rooms in a respectable area. But there were also passages that hinted at something more personal, references to past conversations and shared memories, expressions of gratitude for her kindness during some unspecified difficult time. The relationship was ambiguous, not quite familial, not quite romantic, something in between that the letters illuminated without fully explaining. The map was equally suggestive. The marks along the canal route seemed deliberate, as if Thomas had been planning his walk, noting points of interest or rest stops. But why would a man plan a walk along the canal in November? And why would he mark a spot very near to where his bicycle was found? One possibility, which occurred to Pritchard and would later occur to investigators, was that Thomas had intended to meet someone along the towpath. The marked locations might have been potential meeting points, places where someone could wait without being conspicuous. But if Thomas had been meeting someone, who was that person? And what had happened during the meeting that had ended with a bicycle in the canal and a man vanished? The return train ticket complicated matters further. It suggested Thomas had intended to return to Oxford that evening. The ticket was valid for the evening service, which departed Banbury at 7 o'clock. But if Thomas had left Banbury at 8:30 in the morning and had reached Kidlington by noon, he would have had ample time to walk back to Banbury for the train. Instead, the bicycle was in the canal at Kidlington, miles from Banbury, and Thomas was nowhere to be found. Had he changed his plans? Had something happened that made returning to Banbury impossible or unnecessary? Or had the ticket been a misdirection, a way of suggesting he intended one thing while actually intending another? George Pritchard, who had seen much along the canal in his 7 years as lockkeeper, could not make sense of it. The bicycle in the water suggested violence or accident. The satchel with its money and papers suggested no robbery. The careful planning evident in the map suggested deliberation, not desperation. The letters suggested a life being arranged, not a life being ended. Every piece of evidence pointed in a different direction, and the sum of those directions was confusion. Pritchard went to bed that night with the feeling that something dark had happened on the canal, something that the water was hiding and might never reveal. The search resumed at dawn on the 8th of November. More men had joined, drawn by word that had spread through the canal community and into the villages along its route. They dragged the canal south from Kidlington toward Thrupp, then north again toward Nelbridge Lock. They worked in sections, overlapping their search areas to ensure nothing was missed. They peered into the reeds and brambles along the banks. They questioned every bargeman and lockkeeper who passed, asking if anyone had seen a man matching Thomas's description. The answer was always the same, vague and uncertain. Perhaps someone had seen such a man. Perhaps not. The mist had been thick. People went about their business without paying much attention to solitary walkers. The canal was not a place where every passerby was noted and remembered. By the afternoon of the 8th, the searchers had covered 5 miles of canal without finding any trace of Thomas Weldon. No body, no clothing, no possessions beyond the bicycle and satchel. It was as if he had simply stepped off the towpath and ceased to exist. The men were beginning to wonder if the body had been carried far downstream, perhaps all the way to the Thames, or if it had sunk into some deep hole where the grappling hooks could not reach it, or if some other explanation entirely was required. George Pritchard stood on the bank near where the bicycle had been found and looked at the water, black and impenetrable, giving nothing away. The canal kept its secrets. It always had. Word of the disappearance reached Oxford by the evening of the 8th. The newspapers picked up the story, and by the 9th reports were appearing in the local press. "Man vanishes along canal," read one headline. "Bicycle found, owner missing," read another. The stories were brief and speculative, filled with the kinds of phrases newspapers used when facts were scarce. Feared drowned, believed to have fallen, circumstances remain unclear. But the stories brought Thomas Weldon's name into public consciousness and prompted people who had known him to come forward with information. His landlord in Oxford confirmed that Thomas had been preparing to move to London, that everything in his affairs had been in order, that there had been no sign of distress or unusual behaviour. Neighbours remembered him as quiet and respectable. The few clients who still used his printing services spoke of his competence and reliability. A clerk at the bank where Thomas had closed his accounts said he had seemed perfectly normal, had conducted his business efficiently, had even mentioned looking forward to his new position in London. No one had any explanation for why Thomas would have been walking along the canal, why his bicycle would have ended up in the water, or where he'd gone. The police in Oxford took over the investigation from Constable Davies, sending a detective to Kidlington to examine the scene and interview witnesses. The detective, a middle-aged man named Inspector Rawlings, who had worked on several drowning cases along the Thames, approached the matter with professional thoroughness. He walked the towpath in both directions from where the bicycle had been found. He interviewed George Pritchard and Arthur Hebden and every lockkeeper and bargeman who might have seen something. He examined the bicycle and the satchel contents. He sent telegrams to London inquiring about Mrs. Catherine Ashford, and receiving in reply the information that would deepen the mystery rather than resolve it. But on that first day, the 8th of November, as the light failed and the searchers gave up for another night, all that was certain was that Thomas Weldon had vanished and that the canal held the answer somewhere in its dark depths. The bicycle stood in George Pritchard's cottage, drying slowly, a metal ghost that had outlived its owner. And along the towpath, where the mist was gathering again as it did every evening, the place where Thomas had last walked remained silent and empty, giving no sign that anything unusual had ever happened there at all. Chapter 4. The Dragging of the Canal. The work began again at first light on the 9th of November, a Sunday morning when the world should have been at rest, but when the canal gave no peace to those who searched it. The Sabbath meant little to the bargemen and lock-keepers who gathered once more at Kidlington Lock, driven by the ancient understanding that a man lost to the water must be found, that the canal's claim on the dead must be answered, with the living's refusal to abandon their own. The mist was thicker that morning, rolling off the water in great banks that reduced visibility to a few yards. The men worked in near silence, speaking only when necessary, their breath clouding in the cold air as they prepared the grappling equipment for another day of grim labour. Inspector Rawlings had arrived from Oxford, bringing with him 2 constables and a sense of official procedure that both reassured and irritated the canal men in equal measure. The inspector was thorough, methodical, insistent on proper documentation of everything found or observed. He had requisitioned a boat, a flat-bottomed punt that could navigate the shallower areas near the banks, and he intended to supervise the search himself rather than simply directing it from shore. He wore a heavy coat and high boots, and he carried a notebook in which he made constant entries, recording times and locations and the names of everyone involved. The canal men respected competence, and Rawlings demonstrated that quality, but they also understood that no amount of note-taking would give up what the canal chose to hide. The method of dragging was brutal in its simplicity. Heavy iron hooks, each weighing several pounds, were attached at intervals along thick ropes. These ropes were weighted at regular points to ensure they sank to the bottom. 2 teams of men, one on each bank, would walk slowly forward while the rope dragged along the canal bed between them, the hooks catching on anything that offered resistance. When resistance was felt, both teams would stop and slowly draw the rope upward to see what had been snagged. The water was perhaps 12 feet deep in the main channel, deeper in places where the excavation had been more thorough. The bottom was soft with decades of accumulated silt and organic matter, thick mud that released clouds of darkness when disturbed, turning the water opaque and foul-smelling. They began where they had left off the previous day, working systematically south from Kidlington Lock towards Shipton. The canal curved gently through open countryside here, the fields on either side given over to pasture and root crops, the few farmhouses set back from the water and half hidden by trees. It was empty country, silent except for the occasional cry of a crow or the lowing of cattle in distant barns. The towpath was muddy from the previous day's traffic of searchers, churned into a thick paste that clung to boots and made walking difficult. The willow trees along the banks dripped moisture from their bare branches, adding to the general atmosphere of cold misery that settled over the search party. The first hour yielded nothing but the usual debris of canal life: lengths of rotted rope, the broken remains of a boat hook, several sections of timber that had once been part of a lock gate. These items were hauled to the surface, examined briefly, and discarded on the bank. The second hour brought up what appeared to be a bundle of clothing, and for a moment the men's hearts quickened with the terrible certainty that they had found their man. But when the bundle was laid out on the towpath, it proved to be nothing more than old sacking, the remnants of cargo wrapping that had been thrown into the canal years ago, and had now surfaced like some unwanted memory. By mid-morning the mist had begun to lift, revealing a grey sky that promised rain before evening. The temperature remained just above freezing, cold enough that the men's hands grew numb despite their gloves, cold enough that the water seemed to steal heat from anyone who touched it. Inspector Rawlings moved between the 2 teams, observing, questioning, recording. He asked the lockkeepers about the canal's depth and current. He inquired about places where a body might be caught or hidden. He wanted to know about underwater structures, submerged debris, anything that might explain why Thomas Weldon had not been found. George Pritchard, who had been dragging canals for most of his adult life, explained the peculiarities of the waterway. The canal was not a natural river, but an artificial cut, and its bottom was not uniform. In some places the excavation had hit rock, and the channel was relatively smooth and clear. In others it had gone through clay or gravel, creating an irregular surface full of holes and ridges. There were places where old pilings from the original construction remained, hidden beneath the water. There were places where the banks had collapsed over the years, creating underwater shelves and caves. There were places where the current, such as it was, created eddies that could trap floating objects or pull them under. A body entering the water at one point might not be found anywhere near that point. It might drift with the current, however sluggish. It might be caught in underwater debris. It might sink into the soft mud and be covered over, essentially buried where it would never be recovered. This explanation did not comfort Inspector Rawlings, who had hoped for a more straightforward search. But he understood that they had no choice except to continue, to drag every yard of canal between Banbury and Oxford if necessary. He had already sent word for more men, requesting assistance from other districts. If Thomas Weldon was in the canal, they would find him. If he was not in the canal, then some other explanation would have to be sought, and the investigation would take a very different direction. The afternoon brought rain, cold and steady, turning the towpath into a morass, and making the work even more difficult. The men were soaked within an hour, their coats heavy with water, their hands raw from handling the wet ropes. Still they continued, driven by duty and by the knowledge that somewhere, someone was waiting for news of Thomas Weldon, waiting to know what had become of him. The grappling hooks caught and released, bringing up the canal's debris in a slow, methodical excavation of its secrets. A bicycle wheel rusted beyond recognition, the skeleton of a dog, pathetically small, bottles by the dozen, some whole, most broken, a woman's hat, black and Victorian, perfectly preserved by the cold water, a toolbox still containing hammers and chisels that had been lost a generation before. Each discovery was logged, examined and discarded. None brought them any closer to Thomas Weldon. As the afternoon wore on and the light began to fail, the mood among the searchers grew darker. They had covered another 2 miles of canal and found nothing. The water had given up its random accumulation of loss, but had kept the one thing they sought. Inspector Rawlings stood on the bank near Thrupp, watching the rain fall into the canal, watching the circles spread and disappear on the black surface. He was beginning to entertain possibilities he had not wanted to consider. Perhaps Thomas Weldon was not in the canal at all. Perhaps the bicycle and satchel had been placed there deliberately to mislead. Perhaps something else entirely had happened along that towpath, something that had nothing to do with drowning. The search was called off at dusk, with plans to resume the following morning. The men dispersed, exhausted and discouraged, returning to their boats and cottages to dry themselves and eat whatever meals their families had prepared. Inspector Rawlings returned to Oxford to file his report and to begin inquiries in other directions. The canal, having resisted giving up its dead for 2 days, remained dark and silent, its surface already smooth again where the dragging had disturbed it. By morning there would be no sign that anyone had searched there at all. Chapter 5, Theories in the Mist. By the 10th of November, when no body had been recovered despite 3 days of intensive searching, the disappearance of Thomas Weldon had begun to generate the kind of speculation that follows any unexplained event in a small community. The canal workers and villagers, the lock keepers and bargemen, the farmers whose fields bordered the waterway, all had their theories, and these theories multiplied and transformed as they passed from mouth to mouth along the towpath and in the public houses where men gathered in the evenings. Some of these theories were grounded in observation and experience. Others drew from the darker currents of rural superstition that ran beneath the surface of Edwardian rationality, like underground streams beneath cultivated fields. The most straightforward explanation, and the one that Inspector Rawlings initially favoured, was accidental death by drowning. Thomas Weldon had been walking along the towpath, perhaps distracted or careless, and had slipped into the canal. The twisted handlebars of the bicycle suggested he might have been riding when he fell, losing control on the narrow path and plunging into the water. The November cold would have incapacitated him quickly. The heavy coat and boots would have dragged him down. The body would be somewhere in the canal, perhaps caught beneath an underwater obstruction or buried in the soft mud of the bottom. Time and continued searching would eventually reveal it. This explanation had the virtue of simplicity and fit the known facts. A man, a bicycle, a canal. The equation required no additional variables. But even this straightforward account had problems. Arthur Hebden, the lock-keeper at Nell Bridge, insisted that the man he had seen walking south that morning had not been riding a bicycle. He had been walking, moving at a steady pace on foot. If Thomas had been riding the bicycle when he left Banbury, where was it when Hebden saw him at Nell Bridge? Had he stopped somewhere, left the bicycle and continued on foot? And if so, why? The distance from Nell Bridge to Kidlington, where the bicycle was found, was approximately 8 miles. If Thomas had been walking without the bicycle when Hebden saw him at 10 o'clock, and if the bicycle was somehow already at Kidlington, the timeline made no sense. Unless he had doubled back, retrieved the bicycle and then proceeded south again. But why would anyone do such a thing? A second theory, one that found favour among those who thought carefully about the evidence, was suicide. Thomas Weldon had been closing his print shop, abandoning the business his father and grandfather had built, preparing to leave Oxford for the uncertainties of London. Perhaps the weight of these changes had overwhelmed him. Perhaps there were troubles no one knew about, debts beyond those he had acknowledged, romantic disappointments, a despair that he had hidden behind his quiet, competent exterior. The walk along the canal might have been a final journey, a deliberate removal of himself from the places and people he knew. He might have weighted his pockets with stones, walked into the deep water, and allowed the canal to take him. Suicides were rarely straightforward. People often took elaborate measures to ensure they would not be found or identified. As if shame extended beyond death and required concealment even then, this theory had a certain dark plausibility. The letters to Mrs. Ashford in London could be read as a man putting his affairs in order, making arrangements that would matter to someone after he was gone. The map with its marked locations could represent contemplated sites for ending his life, places where the water was deep and the towpath isolated. The return train ticket could be misdirection, a final piece of theatre suggesting normalcy and future plans, while the true intention was death. Victorian and Edwardian England had seen epidemics of suicide, particularly among men of the middle class who found themselves unable to maintain the respectability that their society demanded. The canal offered a means that was relatively certain and, if one was fortunate, relatively quick, but George Pritchard, who had pulled several suicides from the canal over his years as lockkeeper, did not believe this explanation. Suicides, he said, left bodies. The canal eventually gave them up, usually within a few days unless the water was very cold or the body had been weighted down with unusual thoroughness. The searching had been intensive and had covered miles of waterway. If Thomas Weldon had drowned himself anywhere in the vicinity of Kidlington, the grappling hooks would have found him. Moreover, suicides typically left some indication of their intention. A note, a conversation with someone that suggested final farewells, a pattern of behaviour in the days before that signalled desperation. Thomas had shown none of these signs. He had been arranging a new life, not ending an old one. The third theory was murder, and it was this possibility that began to dominate the speculation in the villages and on the canal. Perhaps Thomas had been walking to meet someone. Perhaps there had been an argument, a fight, an act of violence that had ended with Thomas dead and his killer disposing of the bicycle and satchel to make it appear he had drowned. The money in the purse argued against robbery as a motive, but perhaps the killer had been interrupted before he could take it, or perhaps the motive had been something other than theft. Revenge, jealousy, the settling of some grievance that no one knew about. The canal was an ideal place for such violence. Long stretches of towpath were completely isolated. A man could be struck down, his body hidden or thrown into the water, and the killer could disappear without being seen by anyone. This theory gained credibility when word spread about the letters to Mrs. Ashford in London. Who was this woman? What was her relationship to Thomas Weldon? The letters suggested familiarity, perhaps intimacy. Perhaps there was a husband or another man involved, someone who had reason to want Thomas removed. Inspector Rawlings had sent inquiries to London, requesting information about Catherine Ashford, but the replies had been slow in coming and had so far revealed little except that such a woman did exist at the Bloomsbury address, and that she was a widow who let rooms to gentlemen of respectable character. The connection between Thomas and Mrs. Ashford remained unclear, and in that lack of clarity, imagination flourished. The Bargemen had their own theories, born of long experience on the waterways and a worldview that admitted darker possibilities than the authorities were willing to consider. They spoke of rival gangs that controlled certain stretches of canal, men who demanded payment for safe passage and who dealt violently with those who refused. They spoke of thieves who worked the towpaths at night, attacking solitary travellers and throwing the bodies into the water. They spoke of madmen who lived in the marginal spaces along the canal, in ruined cottages or beneath bridges, men whose minds had been broken by the Great War that had not yet happened, but whose predecessors from earlier conflicts still haunted the countryside, dangerous and unpredictable. These theories were dismissed by Inspector Rawlings as folklore, but the Bargemen insisted they knew the canal better than any policeman, and the canal had its dark corners where the law did not reach. More troubling were the theories that drew on older beliefs, the kind that educated people claimed no longer held sway but which persisted nonetheless in rural England. There was talk of the canal being haunted, of certain stretches where men had vanished before without explanation. The willows near where the bicycle was found had a reputation among some of the older lockkeepers as an unlucky place, a spot where the water seemed deeper and darker than it should be, where mist gathered even on clear days. There were stories of figures seen walking the towpath at dusk who vanished when approached, of voices heard calling from the water, of bargemen who refused to pass certain sections after dark. These were the whispers of a world that still believed in things beyond the rational, and while Inspector Rawlings had no patience for such talk, he could not entirely dismiss the unease it created. One witness who came forward on the 11th of November added a disturbing detail that seemed to support the more supernatural interpretations. A woman named Agnes Wilmot, who lived in a cottage near the canal between Kidlington and Thrupp, claimed she had been outside on the evening of the 7th, bringing in washing before dark, when she'd heard screaming from the direction of the water. She described it as a man's voice, crying out in what sounded like terror or pain, though the sound had been distant and distorted by the mist. She'd been too frightened to investigate alone and had called for her husband, but by the time he had come out, the screaming had stopped. They had assumed it was bargemen fighting or some domestic dispute on one of the boats, the kind of thing one heard occasionally on the canal and learned to ignore. It was only when she learned of the missing man that Agnes Wilmot thought to report what she had heard. Inspector Rawlings interviewed Mrs. Wilmot extensively, trying to establish the exact time and location of the screaming. She could not be precise, sometime between 5 and 6 o'clock, she thought, when the light was failing but before full dark. The direction had been north of her cottage, perhaps a quarter mile or more. The sound had lasted only a few moments, 3 or 4 cries that had echoed across the water and then ceased abruptly. Her husband, when questioned, confirmed that his wife had been agitated when she called him, but he himself had heard nothing. He suggested, respectfully, that his wife was of a nervous disposition and sometimes imagined things, particularly after dark. Agnes Wilmot insisted she knew what she had heard, and that the memory of those cries had haunted her sleep every night since. If the screaming was real, and if it was connected to Thomas Weldon's disappearance, it suggested he had lived until evening, had been somewhere on the canal hours after the last confirmed sighting at Knellbridge Lock that morning. What had happened in those intervening hours? Where had he been? And what had occurred at 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening to make him scream in terror? Inspector Rawlings marked the location Mrs. Wilmot indicated on his map and ordered another search of that particular stretch of canal, but the dragging revealed nothing new. The water kept its silence. The theories multiplied and contradicted one another, creating a fog of speculation as thick as the November mist that rose from the canal each morning. Accident, suicide, murder, supernatural intervention. Each had its advocates, each its evidence or lack thereof. The bicycle and the satchel became objects of almost talismanic significance, studied and restudied for clues they might yield. Why were the handlebars twisted? Had Thomas gripped them in a desperate attempt to save himself, or had someone else bent them deliberately? Why was the satchel still attached to the bicycle if Thomas had fallen into the water? Surely it would have come loose in such an accident. And why had the bicycle been found at Kidlington when the last sighting of Thomas was miles away at Knellbridge? The marked map became another source of endless interpretation. What did the pencil marks signify? Were they meeting points, rest stops, places of personal significance? One mark coincided almost exactly with where the bicycle was found. Another was near Knellbridge Lock. A third was close to where Mrs. Wilmot reported hearing screams. Were these coincidences or evidence of premeditation? And premeditation towards what end? Suicide, murder, or some purpose that had never been fulfilled? The notebook, once it had dried sufficiently to be read, added more confusion than clarity. Most of its pages contained accounts and calculations related to the print shop, the mundane arithmetic of a failing business. But on one page, separate from the rest, were several lines of writing that seemed to be notes for a letter, or perhaps a draft of something Thomas had intended to send. The writing was fragmentary, and the water damage had made portions illegible, but what could be read was suggestive. Cannot explain my reasons, but must ask your understanding. Arrangements made as discussed. If circumstances prove otherwise, you will find. The rest was obliterated. To whom had Thomas been writing? Mrs. Ashford, presumably. But what arrangements had they discussed? And what circumstances did Thomas anticipate that might prove otherwise? The fragment raised more questions than it answered. By the middle of November, with no body recovered and no definitive evidence to support any single theory, the investigation began to lose momentum. Inspector Rawlings continued to pursue various lines of inquiry, but he was also dealing with other cases, other demands on his time. The dragging of the canal was suspended after a week, though lock-keepers and bargemen were instructed to remain alert for any sign of a body. The newspapers moved on to other stories. The public houses found new topics of conversation. The mystery of Thomas Weldon's disappearance settled into that category of events that are discussed less and less frequently, until they become part of local lore, stories told on dark evenings but no longer actively investigated. Only a few people continued to search for answers. George Pritchard walked the towpath regularly, studying the water, thinking about the bicycle and the screams and the man who had walked past his lock that morning and then vanished. Inspector Rawlings kept the file open, adding notes when new information emerged, but privately he believed they would never know what had happened. And in London, Mrs. Catherine Ashford received the news that Thomas Weldon had disappeared and that his fate was unknown, and she kept whatever grief or knowledge she possessed to herself, writing no letters to the police, offering no theories, maintaining a silence that was as deep and impenetrable as the canal water itself. Chapter 6. The Woman in London. The telegram reached Catherine Ashford on the afternoon of the 10th of November, delivered by a boy from the post office who waited on the doorstep of the Bloomsbury townhouse for a reply that never came. Mrs. Ashford read the message in the hallway. Standing beneath the gas lamp that burned even in daytime in that dim space, and her face, according to the landlady who observed her from the parlour doorway, showed no expression whatsoever. She folded the telegram carefully, placed it in the pocket of her dress, and climbed the stairs to her rooms on the second floor. She did not emerge for the remainder of that day or the day following. When the landlady knocked to inquire if she required anything, Mrs. Ashford's voice came through the closed door, thanking her politely, but declining all offers of assistance. Catherine Ashford was 38 years old in the autumn of 1908, a widow of 8 years' standing, and a woman who had learned to navigate the narrow channels of respectability available to women of her class and circumstances. She had been born Catherine Moore in Berkshire, the daughter of a country solicitor whose practice had been modest but steady, providing a comfortable if not prosperous life for his family. She had been educated at home by a governess, had learned all the accomplishments expected of a young woman of her station, piano, watercolour, French needlework, and had been raised with the understanding that marriage was the only real future open to her. When she was 22, she had married Harold Ashford, a man 15 years her senior who worked as a senior clerk in the India Office in London. The marriage had been, by all external measures, perfectly conventional. Harold Ashford had been steady, respectable, and moderately successful in his profession. They had lived in modest but comfortable lodgings in Bloomsbury, attended church regularly, maintained appropriate social connections. They had not been blessed with children, a disappointment that Catherine bore with the stoic acceptance expected of women who understood that such matters were in God's hands. Harold had been kind to her in his distant way, had provided for her material needs, had never raised his voice or hand to her. He had also never engaged her thoughts or feelings in any meaningful sense, had never asked what she dreamed about or feared or hoped for. Their marriage had been a companionship of parallel solitudes, each occupying the same space without truly inhabiting it together. When Harold died in 1900, felled by a heart seizure at his desk in the India office, Catherine found herself at 30 years old in possession of a small pension and a devastating freedom. The pension was sufficient to support her in careful economy, but not in any comfort. The freedom was devastating because she discovered that she had no idea what to do with it. She had spent her entire life preparing for marriage and then living within marriage, and now she was neither maiden nor wife, but something else, something for which society had no clear place or purpose. She was too young to retire into elderly widowhood, too old to remarry easily, too poor to live as a lady of leisure, too genteel to work in any capacity that would not destroy her social standing. She had solved the problem as many women in her position solved it, by letting rooms. The Bloomsbury townhouse where she and Harold had lived was too large for her alone, and the rent consumed most of her pension. By dividing the house and taking in lodgers, gentlemen of respectable profession who required accommodation in London, she could maintain her residence and supplement her income. It was work that could be performed while maintaining the fiction that one was not working, that one was simply extending hospitality to suitable persons who happened to pay for the privilege. Over the years, she had developed a small but steady clientele, young solicitors waiting for partnerships, civil servants new to London, occasionally a university man doing research at the British Museum. She kept a clean, quiet house. She provided breakfast and dinner. She asked no questions and tolerated no irregularity. Her reputation was irreproachable. It was in the capacity of landlady that she had first encountered Thomas Weldon, though the exact circumstances and timing of their meeting were details she never shared with the authorities. What is known is that Thomas had written to her in the summer of 1908, inquiring about rooms, and that she had replied favourably. He had mentioned that he would be coming to London in December to take up a position with a printing firm in Clerkenwell. He had asked if she might hold rooms for him from the first of that month. She had agreed. Subsequent letters had been exchanged, perhaps a dozen over the course of several months. These were the letters that had been found in Thomas's satchel, though Mrs. Ashford's replies to him, if they existed, were never recovered. But the letters found in the satchel suggested a correspondence that had gone beyond the merely businesslike. There were passages that indicated Thomas and Catherine had met before, perhaps years earlier, though where and under what circumstances remained unclear. There were references to conversations they had shared, to books they had both read, to a period when Thomas had been in London and had visited Mrs. Ashford on several occasions. The tone was formal but warm, the formality perhaps a matter of propriety given that unmarried men and women did not correspond informally, but the warmth unmistakable in small phrases and gentle expressions of regard. "Your letters have been a source of great comfort during this difficult time," Thomas had written, in one. "I think often of our conversations last spring and of your kindness in listening to the concerns of a troubled mind," he had written in another. What troubled mind, what concerns, and what had happened last spring that brought Thomas to London and to Mrs. Ashford's doorstep? Inspector Rawlings. When he finally travelled to London on the 15th of November to interview Mrs. Ashford, hoped to find answers to these questions. He found instead a woman who was perfectly polite, perfectly composed, and perfectly unhelpful. She received him in her parlour, a neat room, furnished with the kind of modest comfort that characterised respectable gentility on limited means. She offered tea. She expressed appropriate shock and sorrow at the news of Thomas's disappearance. And she answered every question with precisely calibrated responses that revealed nothing. Yes, she had been expecting Mr. Weldon to take rooms beginning in December. No, she had not seen him since his last visit to London in the spring. That visit had been brief, only a few days, and had concerned his inquiries about lodging in advance of his planned move from Oxford. He had called upon her to view the rooms and to discuss terms. Their conversations had been entirely proper and had concerned only the practical arrangements of his accommodation. She had found him to be a gentleman of excellent character, and had looked forward to having him as a lodger. His disappearance was a tragedy, and she hoped sincerely that he would be found safe, though she understood from the inspector's questions that such hope was likely misplaced. "And the letters?" Rawlings asked. "The letters that suggested a familiarity beyond that of prospective landlady and lodger?" Mrs. Ashford's expression did not change. The letters, she said, were private correspondence, and while she understood that the inspector was investigating a possible crime, she did not see how the content of her letters to Mr. Weldon or his letters to her could be relevant. They had written to each other over the summer on various subjects. Mr. Weldon had been facing significant changes in his life and had appreciated having someone with whom he could correspond frankly. She had been pleased to offer what comfort she could through the medium of letters. There had been nothing improper in their correspondence, and she would appreciate if the inspector would not suggest otherwise. Rawlings, who had dealt with reticent witnesses before, pressed gently but firmly. Had Mrs. Ashford known Mr. Weldon before this year? Yes, she admitted after a pause. She had made his acquaintance several years earlier, though she did not recall the exact date or circumstances. It had been a casual meeting, nothing of significance. They had discovered a mutual interest in literature and had occasionally corresponded on that subject. When Mr. Weldon had decided to seek a position in London, he had thought to write to her regarding accommodation, knowing she sometimes let rooms. That was the extent of their relationship. Had there been any romantic attachment? The question hung in the air of the neat parlour like smoke. Mrs. Ashford's hands, folded in her lap, tightened briefly and then relaxed. She looked directly at Inspector Rawlings with eyes that revealed nothing. There had been no romantic attachment, she said clearly. Mr. Weldon had been a correspondent and was to have been a lodger. Nothing more. The inspector would oblige her by not speculating otherwise. Her reputation was all she possessed, and she would not have it tarnished by implications that had no foundation. Rawlings believed she was lying, or at least not telling the complete truth, but he had no grounds on which to challenge her directly. He asked about enemies Mr. Weldon might have had, about financial difficulties, about any indication that he had been in danger or distress. Mrs. Ashford claimed to know nothing of such matters. Their correspondence had been personal but not intimate, friendly but not revealing of the darker aspects of Mr. Weldon's circumstances. She had thought him a respectable man making a reasonable change in his life. She was shocked to learn of his disappearance and could offer no explanation. The interview concluded with courtesy on both sides and satisfaction on neither. Rawlings departed with the certainty that Catherine Ashford knew more than she was saying, but with no means of compelling her to say it. She was a widow of respectable standing, she had broken no laws, and her relationship with Thomas Weldon, whatever its true nature, had been conducted entirely within the bounds of propriety as far as any evidence showed. If there had been something more between them, it had been hidden carefully as that even Thomas's disappearance had not brought it to light. Catherine Ashford closed the door behind the inspector and returned to her parlour. She sat in the chair where she had received him and looked at the November afternoon darkening outside the window. The gas lamps were being lit along the street, small points of light pushing back against the gathering dusk. Inside the house, the clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking time that seemed suddenly both infinite and unbearable. She had told the inspector the truth, after a fashion. There had been no romantic attachment between her and Thomas Weldon, not in any conventional sense. What there had been was something more complicated, something that belonged to both of them, but that could not be spoken of, not to the police, not to anyone. She had met Thomas 8 years before, shortly after Harold's death, when she had been drowning in grief that had nothing to do with her husband and everything to do with the sudden realization of how empty her life had been and would continue to be. Thomas had been in London on some business for his father's print shop, and they had encountered each other by accident at a bookshop near the British Museum. They had spoken briefly about a volume both were interested in. He had been kind, intelligent, perceptive in ways that Harold had never been. They had walked together through the museum afterward, talking about books and art and ideas, and for those few hours Catherine had felt seen and heard in ways she had forgotten were possible. They had maintained a correspondence after that first meeting, careful and proper, but genuine. Thomas came to London occasionally on business and always called upon her when he did. They talked, they walked in parks, they attended lectures and exhibitions. They became friends, though friendship between unmarried men and women was itself a kind of scandal if conducted too openly. Catherine knew that some of her acquaintances suspected more, and she knew that Thomas, in his quiet way, had come to care for her as more than a friend. But there had been no declarations, no impropriety, no romance in any form that the world would recognise. Only two lonely people who had found in each other some measure of understanding and companionship. When Thomas had written to say he would be moving to London, Catherine had allowed herself to imagine a future that was different from the one she had resigned herself to. Perhaps they might see each other regularly. Perhaps in time something more might develop. She was not young, but she was not old. He was unmarried and unattached. It was not impossible. And then the telegram had come, and those fragile imaginings had shattered like ice under a hammer. Thomas was gone. The canal had taken him, or something had taken him, and she would never know what or why, or whether he had thought of her at the end. She had not told the inspector any of this because there was no way to tell it that would not sound sordid or suspicious. A widow and a bachelor conducting a secret friendship across years, exchanging intimate letters, planning to live in the same house. How could such a story be told to the police without inviting exactly the kind of speculation she most feared? Better to say nothing, to claim only the most superficial acquaintance, to protect both Thomas's reputation and her own. But the cost of that protection was borne in silence, and in the knowledge that no one would mourn Thomas as she mourned him, because no one knew there was cause to mourn. The letters she had written to Thomas, the ones he had presumably kept, were somewhere now in the possession of the Oxford police, or perhaps lost forever in the canal. She hoped they had been lost. She had been careful in what she wrote, but there had been moments when care had given way to feeling, when she had expressed thoughts and emotions that were meant only for him. The idea of strangers reading those words, of Inspector Rawlings analysing them for criminal significance, was unbearable. But there was nothing to be done. The letters were beyond her control, as was the narrative that would be constructed around Thomas's disappearance. She could only hold her silence and wait. In the days following the inspector's visit, Catherine Ashford maintained her household routine with mechanical precision. She prepared breakfast for her lodgers, she managed the domestic staff, she paid her bills. She attended church on Sunday. No one observing her would have detected any change in her demeanour or habits. Only at night, alone in her rooms, did she allow herself to feel the weight of Thomas's absence, the questions that would never be answered, the future that would never unfold. She kept his letters in a locked drawer in her writing desk. She read them sometimes, the hours when sleep would not come, tracing his handwriting with her finger, as if touch could bring him back or make sense of what had happened. The final letter he had sent, written just days before his disappearance, had been full of anticipation. He was closing his affairs in Oxford. He was looking forward to the move to London. He was grateful for her assistance in finding rooms, and more grateful still for her friendship during a difficult transition. "I count myself fortunate," he had written, "to have found in you not merely a landlady, but a true friend, someone to whom I can speak honestly, and who understands the complicated business of being human in this world." The letter had ended with arrangements for his arrival on the 1st of December, and with warm regards for her health and happiness. She would never see him on the 1st of December. The room she had prepared would remain empty. The future they had not quite spoken of, but had both imagined would remain forever unrealised. And Catherine Ashford would continue her life in Bloomsbury, letting rooms to gentlemen of respectable character, maintaining her careful economy and her unimpeachable reputation, carrying within her a grief that had no public expression and a knowledge that would never be shared. The canal had taken Thomas Weldon, but it had also taken from her something that she had not fully recognised until it was gone. The possibility of a different life, a better life, a life in which loneliness might have been transformed into something approaching happiness. She folded the inspector's card and placed it in the drawer with Thomas's letters. Then she locked the drawer and turned the key and returned to the empty parlour, where the November darkness pressed against the windows and the gas lamps burned low and steady, holding back the night for a few hours more. Chapter 7. The Inquest. The inquest into the disappearance of Thomas Weldon was convened on the 23rd of November at the Kidlington Parish Hall, a stone building adjacent to the church that served the village for meetings, hearings, and occasional entertainments. The coroner was a man named Edmund Hartley, a physician in his late 50s, who had served as coroner for the district for more than 20 years, and who approached his duties with a combination of medical precision and legal conservatism. He had presided over dozens of inquests, most concerning deaths from natural causes or obvious accidents, and he had learned long ago that the purpose of such proceedings was not to solve mysteries but to establish legal facts sufficient to close cases and allow burial, or, in the absence of a body, to issue a verdict that would satisfy the requirements of law. The hall was filled beyond capacity on the morning the inquest began. The disappearance of Thomas Weldon had captured public attention in a way that ordinary drownings or accidents did not. Perhaps because of the mystery surrounding it, perhaps because Thomas had been a respectable man of the middle class, and such people were not supposed to simply vanish. The villagers of Kidlington came, and the lock-keepers and bargemen from miles along the canal, and representatives of the press from Oxford and even London, all crowding into the hall until Dr. Hartley was forced to ask that the doors be closed and that those who could not find seats wait outside for the proceedings to conclude. The jury had been impanelled the previous day, 12 men drawn from the local population, shopkeepers and farmers and tradesmen who were charged with hearing the evidence and rendering a verdict on how Thomas Weldon had met his death, assuming he was dead at all. The law required an inquest when death was sudden, violent or suspicious, and while no body had been found, the circumstances were sufficiently irregular that Hartley had determined an inquest was warranted. The jury sat in 2 rows of chairs to the right of the coroner's bench, looking uncomfortable in their Sunday clothes, aware that their deliberations would be reported in the newspapers and discussed in every public house in the district. Dr. Hartley opened the proceedings with a brief statement outlining the known facts. Thomas Weldon, aged 34, printer of Oxford, had last been seen alive on the morning of the 7th of November near Nelbridge Lock. His bicycle and personal effects had been discovered at Kidlington Lock later that same day. Despite extensive searching of the canal and surrounding area, no trace of Mr. Weldon had been found. The purpose of the inquest was to determine, based on the available evidence, what had become of him, and whether his death, if death had occurred, had been the result of accident, misadventure, suicide, or unlawful action by another party. The coroner emphasised that the jury's task was to make findings based on evidence, not speculation, and that they should resist the temptation to construct elaborate theories where simple explanations might suffice. The first witness called was Arthur Hebden, the lock-keeper from Nell Bridge. He took his place in the witness chair with an obvious nervousness, twisting his cap in his hands as Hartley administered the oath. Hebden testified that he had seen a man matching Thomas Weldon's description pass his lock on the morning of the 7th, walking south along the towpath at approximately 10 o'clock. The man had been alone, on foot, carrying no visible bag or parcel. He had bid Hebden good morning and had continued walking without pausing. Hebden had thought nothing unusual about the encounter at the time. Solitary walkers were common on the canal, and this gentleman had seemed no different from any other. Only later, when news of the disappearance reached him, did Hebden realise that he had likely been the last person to see Thomas Weldon alive. Under questioning from Dr. Hartley, Hebden was asked to describe the man's demeanour. Had he seemed distressed, hurried, frightened? Hebden thought carefully before answering. The man had seemed preoccupied, he said, lost in thought perhaps, but not distressed. He had walked steadily, neither hurrying nor dawdling. His clothing had been appropriate for walking, a dark coat, good boots. He had carried a walking stick, Hebden now recalled. Though he had not mentioned this detail before, nothing about the encounter had struck Hebden as remarkable or suspicious. It was only in hindsight that it took on significance. George Pritchard was called next, and he testified to the discovery of the bicycle and satchel. He described in detail the position of the bicycle, the twisted handlebars, the location in the shallows near the willows. He explained his decision to search the satchel and his discovery of its contents, the letters, the money, the map, the notebook. He testified to the organisation of the search effort and the 3 days of dragging that had failed to recover a body. Under questioning, Pritchard acknowledged that in his experience as a lockkeeper, he had seen several drownings, and in every case the body had been recovered within a few days. The failure to find Thomas Weldon's body was, in his professional opinion, unusual though not unprecedented. There were places in the canal where a body might be trapped or buried beyond the reach of grappling hooks. Dr. Hartley asked Pritchard for his assessment of the bicycle's condition. Could the twisted handlebars have resulted from a fall into the canal, or did they suggest something else? Pritchard weighed his answer carefully. The handlebars could have been twisted by the force of impact if the bicycle had been moving with speed when it entered the water, he said. They could also have been twisted if someone had gripped them desperately while struggling in the water. Or they could have been twisted deliberately, though for what purpose he could not say. The position of the bicycle, half in and half out of the water, suggested it had not been thrown in with force but had entered more slowly, perhaps rolling or being pushed. But these were observations, Pritchard emphasised, not conclusions. He was a lockkeeper, not a detective. Inspector Rawlings was the next witness, and his testimony occupied the better part of the morning. He recounted the investigation in methodical detail, the interviews with witnesses, the dragging of the canal, the examination of Thomas Weldon's affairs in Oxford, the visit to Mrs. Ashford in London. He presented Thomas's background, his business troubles, his plans for London, his apparent stability of character. He acknowledged that the investigation had produced more questions than answers. There was no evidence of foul play, but neither was there conclusive evidence of accident or suicide. The disappearance remained unexplained. The letters to Mrs. Ashford came under particular scrutiny. Dr. Hartley asked Rawlings to characterise their content. Were they the letters of a man contemplating suicide? Rawlings said he did not believe so. The letters suggested someone making practical arrangements for a new life, not someone preparing to end his life. Did the letters suggest romantic entanglement that might have led to violence from a jealous rival? Rawlings said Mrs. Ashford had denied any romantic relationship, and while he harboured doubts about the completeness of her testimony, he had found no evidence of any third party who might have had motive to harm Thomas Weldon. The letters remained something of a puzzle, suggesting a relationship that was more than casual but less than scandalous, conducted with discretion and apparent propriety. The map with its pencil marks was introduced as evidence, and de Hartley asked for Rawlings's interpretation. The inspector said the marks could represent intended stops along a planned walk, or they could represent meeting points with some unknown person, or they could simply indicate places of interest Thomas had noted for reasons that would never be known. One mark coincided with the location where the bicycle was found, which suggested either planning or an unfortunate coincidence. Without Thomas alive to explain the marks, their significance remained speculative. Agnes Wilmot was called to testify about the screaming she had heard on the evening of the 7th. She was a small, anxious woman who spoke in barely audible tones until Dr. Hartley asked her twice to raise her voice so the jury could hear. She repeated what she had told Inspector Rawlings, that she had been outside her cottage bringing in washing, when she had heard a man's voice crying out from the direction of the canal. The cries had sounded like terror or pain. They had lasted only moments before ceasing abruptly. She had called for her husband, but by the time he arrived, there had been no further sound. She had reported it because she believed in her heart that she had heard Thomas Weldon in his last moments, though she acknowledged she could not prove this. Under cross-examination from one of the jurors, Mrs. Wilmot admitted that her cottage was some distance from the canal and that the mist had been thick that evening. Could she be certain the sound had come from the water and not from somewhere else? She said she knew the sounds of her surroundings, knew the difference between a fox's scream and a man's voice, knew that what she had heard was human and was in distress. The juryman pressed further. Could it have been bargemen fighting, as her husband had suggested? Could it have been someone else entirely unconnected to Thomas Weldon? Mrs. Wilmot's voice grew firmer. She knew what she had heard, and she knew it was connected to the missing man. She could not prove it with evidence, but she knew it in her soul. The medical evidence, such as it was, came from Dr. Hartley himself, who noted for the record that without a body no determination of cause of death could be made. If Thomas Weldon had drowned, There would be no way to know whether the drowning had been accidental or deliberate. If he had suffered some other fate, there was similarly no way to determine what that fate had been. The law required an inquest to determine cause of death, but in this case the cause could only be presumed, not proven. Dr. Hartley acknowledged the difficulty of the situation, but said the jury would need to make their determination based on the balance of probabilities rather than on certainty. The proceedings concluded with closing statements from Inspector Rawlings and from Dr. Hartley himself. Rawlings summarised the evidence and noted that while the investigation remained open, no clear explanation for Thomas Weldon's disappearance had emerged. The balance of evidence suggested death by drowning, but whether by accident, suicide or foul play could not be determined with confidence. Dr. Hartley addressed the jury at greater length, reviewing each piece of evidence and outlining the possible verdicts available to them. They could find death by misadventure, which would indicate accidental drowning. They could find death by suicide if they believed Thomas had taken his own life. They could find unlawful killing if they believed another party had been responsible. Or they could return an open verdict acknowledging that the evidence was insufficient to determine cause of death. The jury retired to deliberate and returned within an hour. Their foreman, a grocer from Kidlington, rose to deliver the verdict. The jury found that Thomas Weldon had died on or about the 7th of November 1908, and that the cause of death was drowning in the Oxfordshire Canal. As to whether the drowning was accidental, suicidal, or the result of unlawful action, the jury could not determine with sufficient certainty and therefore returned an open verdict. It was, Dr. Hartley noted as he closed the proceedings, an unsatisfactory conclusion, but it was the most honest one the evidence would support. Thomas Weldon was legally dead, but how he had died remained an unanswered question. The inquest was concluded. The crowd dispersed slowly from the parish hall, discussing the verdict and the testimony, satisfied to have witnessed the proceedings, but dissatisfied with the lack of resolution. The newspapers would report the verdict with headlines that emphasised the mystery rather than the findings. And along the canal, life would continue as it always had, the water flowing dark and patient, keeping whatever secrets it possessed, giving up nothing more than it had already revealed. Chapter 8. Whispers along the water. The open verdict satisfied no one, and in the absence of official closure, the story of Thomas Weldon's disappearance began its transformation from unexplained death to local legend. This process was gradual and organic, occurring in the public houses along the canal where bargemen gathered in the evenings, in the cottages of lockkeepers where families spoke in low voices after dark, in the villages where gossip was currency and mystery was treasure. The facts of the case, the bicycle, the satchel, the missing body, became fixed points around which imagination constructed elaborate structures of possibility. By the winter of 1908, barely a month after the inquest, Thomas Weldon had become more myth than man. His disappearance a story told and retold until the telling itself became more real than whatever truth lay beneath. The bargemen were among the first to incorporate Thomas Weldon into the dark folklore of the canal. These men and their families lived on the waterways, knew them intimately, and maintained an oral tradition of stories about the dangers and mysteries that attended life on the water. Every stretch of canal had its tales, of drownings and hauntings, of bad luck and good fortune, of places where the water ran strange and where wise men took precautions. The spot near Kidlington where Thomas's bicycle had been found became one of these places, a section of towpath that acquired a reputation for being unlucky, even cursed. Bargemen began to time their journeys to avoid passing that particular stretch after dark. Lockkeepers reported hearing strange sounds from the direction of the willows where the bicycle had been caught. Whispers, they said, or the echo of someone calling out in distress. Whether these sounds were real or imagined, whether they were the product of wind and water or of minds primed by knowledge of what had happened there, was impossible to determine. But the reports persisted and multiplied. A bargeman claimed to have seen a figure standing on the towpath near the willows at dusk, a man in a dark coat who vanished when the barge drew closer. A lockkeeper's child swore she had heard someone crying in the night, the sound coming from the water itself. An elderly woman who lived near the canal said she had seen lights moving along the towpath where no lights should be, flickering through the mist like lanterns carried by invisible hands. Each story was met with skepticism by some and belief by others, and each added another layer to the growing legend. The public houses became venues for the competitive telling of Thomas Weldon stories. In the Boat Inn at Thrupp and the King's Head at Kidlington, in the Prince of Wales at Banbury and the Jolly Waterman at Oxford, men gathered over pints of bitter and told what they knew or claimed to know or had heard from someone who knew someone who had been there. The stories grew more elaborate with each telling. Thomas Weldon had been meeting a woman, a lady of high birth whose husband had discovered the affair and hired men to kill him. Thomas Weldon had been a spy carrying documents related to naval secrets. And had been murdered by German agents who then disposed of his body in the canal. Thomas Weldon had owed money to dangerous men and had tried to escape by staging his own disappearance, but the plan had gone wrong and he had ended up dead anyway. None of these stories had any foundation in evidence, but evidence was not required for stories told in public houses. What mattered was drama, mystery, the satisfaction of providing an explanation where authorities had failed. The fact that Thomas had been an ordinary printer leading an ordinary life was insufficient for the needs of narrative. He needed to be something more. Tragic lover, secret agent, desperate debtor. Because ordinary men did not simply vanish without explanation. The mundane required no story. The extraordinary demanded one. Among the more superstitious villagers and canal workers, explanations drawn from older beliefs began to circulate. There was talk of the canal being built over the places that should have been left undisturbed, ancient burial grounds, sites of medieval execution, fields where plague victims had been interred in mass graves. The dead resented the intrusion of the waterway these stories suggested, and occasionally claimed lives in retribution. The spot near Kidlington had once been, according to one elderly bargeman, the site of a gibbet where criminals had been hanged and left to rot as warning to others. The bodies had been buried nearby, unconsecrated ground, and their spirits still walked. Thomas Weldon had simply been unlucky enough to pass through at the wrong time, in the wrong season. When the boundary between the living world and the dead world grew thin, these explanations found particular resonance in the late autumn and winter months, when the canal took on its darkest aspect. The short days and long nights, the persistent fog, the bare trees and frozen ground, all contributed to an atmosphere in which supernatural explanations seemed no more improbable than natural ones. The canal in winter was a place of profound isolation. A man walking the towpath might go hours without seeing another living soul. The silence was absolute except for the occasional cry of a bird or the crack of ice forming on the water's surface. It was easy in such circumstances to believe that other forces were at work, that the world contained more than what could be seen and measured and explained by science. Inspector Rawlings, when he heard reports of these stories circulating along the canal, was both frustrated and unsurprised. He had dealt with enough cases to know that unexplained deaths bred folklore, that people required narrative coherence even when the facts provided none. He issued statements to the local press emphasising that the investigation into Thomas Weldon's disappearance remained open, that there was no evidence of supernatural involvement, and that anyone with factual information should come forward to the police rather than spreading rumours. These statements had little effect. The stories continued to spread and evolve, taking on lives of their own, detached from any official account. George Pritchard, walking the towpath on his regular inspections of his section of canal, found himself increasingly troubled by the atmosphere that had developed around the spot where he had found Thomas's bicycle. He was not a man given to superstition. He had worked the canal for years and had a practical understanding of its dangers and peculiarities, but he could not deny that something felt different about that stretch of waterway after Thomas's disappearance. The willows seemed darker there, the water more opaque, the air heavier. Bargemen, who had passed through his lock for years without comment, now asked him questions. Had anything else unusual been found? Had he heard strange sounds at night? Did he believe the stories about hauntings? Pritchard answered honestly that he had found nothing more and heard nothing unusual, But privately he wondered whether the power of suggestion and collective belief could create an atmosphere that felt real even if it had no objective foundation. By Christmas of 1908, the story had spread beyond the immediate vicinity of the canal. Newspapers in London picked up the tale, running sensationalised accounts under headlines like "The Phantom of the Oxfordshire Canal" and "Mystery of the Vanishing Printer." These articles, written for audiences hungry for Gothic mystery, emphasised the more theatrical aspects of the case: the mist-shrouded towpath, the anguished screams in the night, the bicycle found half-submerged with its twisted handlebars suggesting desperate struggle. The fact that the inquest had returned an open verdict was presented as evidence that even the authorities believed something uncanny had occurred. Thomas Weldon, who had lived a quiet life seeking only security and modest advancement, came in death a figure of romantic tragedy, his fate subject to endless speculation and mythologizing. The legends took different forms depending on who told them. Among the Bargemen, Thomas became a cautionary tale about the dangers of walking the towpath alone after dark, proof that the canal demanded respect and that carelessness or bad luck could result in sudden death. Among the villagers, he became a ghost story told to frighten children and entertain adults, the missing man who still walked the towpath on foggy nights, searching for something he had lost or trying to reach a destination he would never attain. Among the more educated classes who read about the case in newspapers, Thomas became a symbol of modernity's failure to fully explain the world, evidence that despite science and progress, mysteries remained that defied rational understanding. There were those who claimed to have encountered Thomas's ghost. A bargeman swore he had seen a figure in a dark coat standing on the bank near the willows, watching the boats pass with hollow eyes. When the bargeman had called out, the figure had turned and walked into the mist, disappearing before the barge could draw alongside. A young woman from Kidlington claimed she had been walking home along a lane that ran parallel to the canal when she had seen a man matching Thomas's description standing at the water's edge, staring down as if searching for something submerged. She had been frightened and had run home, and when she looked back from a safe distance, the figure was gone. An elderly lockkeeper reported that on several occasions he had heard footsteps on the towpath outside his cottage late at night, steady footsteps like someone walking with purpose. But when he went to investigate, there was never anyone there. These accounts were impossible to verify and equally impossible to disprove. They might have been genuine experiences, misidentifications of ordinary occurrences, or complete fabrications designed to insert the tellers into the growing legend. Whatever their truth value, they contributed to the sense that Thomas Weldon's disappearance had left a mark on the canal, a psychic impression that manifested in various ways to various people. The towpath near Kidlington became a place that people avoided when possible, especially after dark, and children were warned not to play near the water there, not just because of the physical danger of drowning, but because of something else, something less tangible but equally real to those who believed. The letters to Mrs. Ashford became another source of speculation and story. The fact that their complete contents had never been made public allowed imaginations to fill in the gaps. Thomas and Catherine were secret lovers, some stories claimed, conducting a passionate affair that society would not permit. They had planned to marry once Thomas reached London, but someone, Catherine's family perhaps, or some rival for her affections, had arranged his murder to prevent the union. Other versions held that Catherine was not what she seemed, that she was involved in criminal activities or espionage, and that Thomas had discovered something that had marked him for death. These stories bore no relationship to the actual Catherine Ashford, who continued her quiet life in Bloomsbury, but facts had ceased to matter once the stories took on their own momentum. By the spring of 1909, the story had begun to stabilise into several standard versions, each told with variations but following the same basic narrative structures. There was the tragic romance version, in which Thomas died trying to reach the woman he loved. There was the supernatural version, in which the canal itself or the spirits that inhabited it had claimed him for unknowable reasons. There was the murder version, in which unknown parties had killed Thomas for equally unknown motives and had made his death look like an accident or suicide. And there was the mystery version, which eschewed explanation entirely and simply emphasized the inexplicable nature of his disappearance. The way a man could cease to exist between one moment and the next without leaving any trace. The actual facts of the case, such as they were, became secondary to these narrative frameworks. What mattered was not what had happened, but what the story meant, what it revealed about the fragility of human existence, the persistence of mystery in an age of increasing rationality, the dark currents that ran beneath the surface of everyday life. Thomas Weldon's disappearance became a story people told to make sense of their own anxieties about death and vanishing, about the possibility that the ordinary world might suddenly open and swallow them whole, about the limits of knowledge and the persistence of the unknowable. The canal itself seemed to absorb and reflect these stories. The water had always been dark, but now it seemed darker, more menacing. The mist that rose each morning had always been present, but now it seemed charged with meaning, as if it concealed not just the opposite bank, but secrets and dangers and possibilities. The towpath had always been isolated in places, but now that isolation felt intentional, as if the canal had arranged itself to create spaces where people could disappear. The willows near Kidlington, which had simply been trees, became something more, markers of a place where the boundary between presence and absence, between life and death, had proven permeable. George Pritchard, who had been the first to find Thomas's bicycle, and who therefore occupied a central role in all versions of the story, found himself unwillingly transformed into a character in the legend. Bargemen and visitors would stop at his lock and ask him to tell the story firsthand, to show them where the bicycle had been found, to confirm or deny various details they had heard. Pritchard grew weary of these requests, but understood they were unavoidable. He had become the custodian of the story whether he wished it or not, and each retelling, each answer to questions, each gesture toward the willows where Thomas's bicycle had been caught, reinforced the legend and ensured its continuation. By the time a year had passed since Thomas Weldon's disappearance, the story had achieved a kind of permanence. It had entered the oral tradition of the canal, had been reported in newspapers and discussed in parlours, had inspired speculation and debate and imaginative elaboration. The facts, such as they were, had been overwhelmed by interpretation and myth. Thomas Weldon, the man, the printer from Oxford, who had sought a better life in London, had been almost entirely obscured by the Thomas Weldon the legend, the vanished man whose fate remained forever uncertain, and whose story would be told as long as the canal flowed and people gathered to speak of the mysteries that haunted its dark water. Chapter 9. The Silent Witnesses. The places themselves remembered, if places could be said to remember. The stretch of canal between Nelbridge Lock and Kidlington, the section of towpath where Thomas Weldon had walked on that November morning in 1908, remained physically unchanged by his disappearance. The water flowed as it always had, dark and patient. The willows grew along the banks, their roots reaching down into the mud, their branches moving in the wind. The locks opened and closed for the passage of boats, the machinery of wood and iron performing its function with mechanical indifference. Yet those who worked and travelled that section of canal reported a change that was impossible to quantify, but unmistakable in its presence. The place had acquired a weight, a heaviness of atmosphere, as if the unanswered questions surrounding Thomas's fate had somehow imprinted themselves upon the landscape. The towpath itself bore no marks of what had happened there. Rain and the passage of countless feet had long since erased any physical trace of Thomas's final walk. The spot where his bicycle had been found, in the shallows near the willows, showed no sign of disturbance. The canal had closed over whatever had entered it, had absorbed and concealed and moved on. George Pritchard, standing at that spot on the anniversary of the disappearance, found it remarkable how completely the physical world could erase evidence of human tragedy. If he had not known what had happened here, he would see only what he always saw: water, tree, the towpath extending in both directions, the ordinary landscape of the canal. Yet knowing what he knew, seeing what could not be seen, the place felt fundamentally different. The lock at Kidlington, which Pritchard tended with the same competence he had always brought to his work, became a kind of informal memorial site. Travellers passing through would sometimes pause and ask about the missing man, and Pritchard would point to the willows and recount the basic facts of the discovery. Some visitors left small tokens, flowers mostly, placed on the bank near where the bicycle had been found, though these tokens never lasted long, claimed by weather or by bargemen who found such sentimentality inappropriate. Pritchard neither encouraged nor discouraged these gestures. They seemed to him expressions of a need that people had to mark significant places, to acknowledge that something important had happened, even if what that something was remained mysterious. Arthur Hebden at Nelbridge Lock, who had been the last confirmed person to see Thomas Weldon alive, found himself similarly transformed into an unwilling monument to the case. His brief encounter with Thomas on that November morning had lasted perhaps 30 seconds. An exchange of morning greetings between a lockkeeper and a passing walker, utterly unremarkable at the time. But that 30-second encounter had taken on enormous significance in retrospect, had been analysed and questioned and discussed until Hebden himself sometimes wondered whether his memory of it was accurate or whether it had been altered by subsequent knowledge and interpretation. He remembered a man walking south along the towpath. He remembered a greeting exchanged. He remembered nothing that suggested anything unusual was about to occur. The ordinariness of the encounter was itself remarkable, proof that tragedy gave no warning, that a man could walk toward his death with no sign in his bearing or a manner of what awaited him. The section of towpath between Nelbridge and Kidlington, approximately 8 miles of canal with several locks and several small villages nearby, became a kind of absent witness to events that had left no clear evidence. People walked this same path every day, bargemen leading their horses, villagers moving between settlements, occasional travellers taking the scenic route toward Oxford. Each person who walked that section after November 1908 was walking where Thomas Weldon had walked, following the same narrow track between water and bramble, seeing largely the same views he must have seen. Yet none of them could say what had happened to him. The path kept its silence. The water beside it revealed nothing. The landscape that had witnessed whatever occurred had somehow failed to preserve any record that human investigation could decipher. Inspector Rawlings, who had officially closed the active investigation in the spring of 1909 while keeping the case file open for new information, occasionally returned to walk the towpath himself. He was a methodical man who believed that crime scenes, revisited with fresh perspective, sometimes yielded insights that had been missed during initial investigation. He walked from Nelbridge to Kidlington multiple times, trying to understand Thomas's route, trying to see what Thomas would have seen, trying to imagine what could have happened that would result in a bicycle in the water and a man vanished. The exercise yielded no new insights, but Rawlings found it impossible to abandon entirely. Something had happened along this path. Someone knew or had known what that something was. The place itself had been present for whatever occurred, and Rawlings found himself studying it as if it might somehow communicate what it had witnessed. The physical evidence that remained, the bicycle and satchel now stored in the police evidence room in Oxford, offered no additional clues upon re-examination. The bicycle was simply a bicycle, well made and well maintained, its twisted handlebars the only feature suggesting anything unusual. Mechanical experts consulted by Rawlings confirmed that the handlebars could have been twisted either by impact or by forceful gripping, but could not determine which with certainty. The satchel and its contents had been preserved, but revealed nothing beyond what had been noted initially. The letters to Mrs. Ashford remained enigmatic, suggesting a relationship that was significant but not clearly defined. The map with its marks remained suggestive without being conclusive. The notebook's water-damaged pages had been carefully dried and photographed, but the fragmentary notes they contained led nowhere. The canal itself, as a physical entity, was perhaps the most frustrating witness of all. Water preserved nothing and revealed little. Bodies that entered it might surface or might not. Objects that sank into its depths might remain forever, or might eventually be dredged up by chance. The canal's depth varied, its bottom was irregular, its currents were unpredictable. In the year following Thomas's disappearance, the canal had given up several bodies. A child who had fallen in near Banbury, an elderly man who had collapsed and rolled from the bank near Oxford, a drunk who had missed his footing in the dark near Shipton. Each body had been recovered within days of entering the water. That Thomas Weldon's body had never surfaced remained the central anomaly of the case. The fact that all theories had to accommodate, but that none could adequately explain. The seasons passed over the canal, marking time in the way that landscapes mark time. The winter of 1908 froze the water solid, and people walked on the ice where Thomas had supposedly drowned. The spring of 1909 brought floods that raised the water level and scoured the banks, and searchers briefly hoped that the body might be dislodged and revealed, but nothing was found. The summer brought growth and warmth, and the willows near Kidlington grew thick with leaves that concealed the exact spot where the bicycle had been caught. The autumn of 1909 brought mist again, and the anniversary of Thomas's disappearance was marked by a small notice in the Oxford newspapers noting that 1 year had passed without resolution. George Pritchard, who lived beside the canal and knew its moods and rhythms as intimately as anyone, found himself watching the water with new attention after Thomas's disappearance. He had spent years observing the canal as a practical matter, noting its depth, monitoring its flow, maintaining its infrastructure. Now he found himself observing it as a kind of mystery, wondering what lay beneath its surface, wondering what it contained that had not yet been revealed. He knew every visible aspect of his section of waterway, every bank, every bend, every underwater obstruction that might catch a rope or boat. Yet the canal retained depths that he could not see or measure, spaces where anything might be hidden and might remain hidden forever. The villages along the canal, Kidlington, Thrupp, Shipton, absorbed the story of Thomas Weldon's disappearance and moved on. Life continued with its ordinary concerns. Crops were planted and harvested. Children were born, grew, went to school. The war that would come in 1914 was still unimaginable, and England in 1909 and 1910 seemed stable and eternal in the way that epochs always seem to those living within them. Thomas Weldon became a story that was told occasionally but no longer discussed constantly, a local mystery that had its moment of intense interest and then settled into the background of collective memory. Yet the place where he had vanished remained marked by his absence in ways that were subtle but persistent. Bargemen still timed their journeys to avoid passing the willows near Kidlington after dark. Lockkeepers still reported occasional strange sounds or sights in that vicinity, though these reports grew less frequent as time passed. The spot retained its reputation as unlucky, a place where the ordinary rules seemed slightly suspended, where the boundary between the known and unknown felt thinner than elsewhere. Whether this was objective reality or collective psychology was impossible to determine, but the effect was the same. The place remembered, or seemed to remember, even as individual memories faded. Inspector Rawlings, in his later years, would sometimes take out the file on Thomas Weldon and review the evidence one more time. He had solved many cases during his career, had brought criminals to justice, had provided closure to families who had lost loved ones to violence or accident. The Weldon case remained the one that had defeated him, the mystery he had never solved. In his retirement, he would occasionally walk the towpath from Nell Bridge to Kidlington, an old man retracing the steps of an investigation that had consumed months of his professional life and had yielded nothing definitive. The canal flowed past him, dark and patient, keeping whatever secrets it possessed, giving up nothing beyond what it had surrendered on that November day in 1908, when a boy and his dog had found a bicycle in the shallows. The landscape endured, the water flowed, the locks opened and closed, the towpath stretched between villages and fields, serving its function, bearing its traffic, marking the boundary between land and water, between the known paths of human travel and the dark depths that lay beside them. And somewhere in that landscape, in those depths, or perhaps nowhere at all, lay the answer to what had happened to Thomas Weldon. The silent witnesses, the water, the path, the willows, the locks, maintained their silence, speaking to no one, revealing nothing, simply existing as they had always existed, indifferent to human questions and human need for resolution. Chapter 10. The Echo in the Dark. The years accumulated like silt at the bottom of the canal, layer upon layer, each season adding its weight to what had come before. Thomas Weldon's disappearance receded from immediate memory into history, from current event into past occurrence, from active mystery into cold case. By 1914, when the Great War erupted and the concerns of the nation turned to matters of survival and sacrifice, the disappearance of a printer from Oxford 6 years earlier seemed a small thing, a personal tragedy subsumed by collective catastrophe. The canal continued to carry its traffic, though the war reduced the number of boats and the men available to work them. Young lockkeepers left to serve in France were replaced by old men called back from retirement or by women who learned to operate the heavy gates and paddle gear that had previously been considered too demanding for female strength. George Pritchard was too old for military service and remained at his lock, watching the war years pass with a mixture of relief and guilt. He had survived when younger men had not. The canal, which had seemed like the entire world when he was a young man, now seemed like a refuge, a place apart from the slaughter occurring across the channel. He tended his lock, assisted the reduced traffic, and thought sometimes about Thomas Weldon, who had also been spared the trenches by dying or disappearing 6 years before the war began. There was something obscene in the thought, yet Pritchard could not avoid it. Thomas's fate, whatever it had been, had at least been individual, personal, comprehensible in scale. The war was none of these things. The war changed the canal in subtle ways. There were fewer boats, fewer bargemen, less commerce. Some locks fell into disrepair for lack of maintenance. The water grew more choked with weed. The atmosphere of the waterway, already melancholy, took on an additional weight of abandonment and decline. Young men who might have become bargemen or lock keepers were dying in Flanders, and their absence created gaps in the life of the canal that would never be filled. The traditions and knowledge that would have been passed from father to son were interrupted, lost, forgotten. By the time the war ended in 1918, the canal was already becoming an anachronism, a relic of an earlier industrial age being superseded by lorries and motorways, by a world that had no more patience for the slow movement of water and the patient labour of locks. Catherine Ashford in London lived through the war years in her Bloomsbury townhouse, maintaining her boarders, managing her household, enduring the Zeppelin raids and the food shortages, and the endless casualty lists that appeared in the newspapers. She was 48 years old in 1918, no longer young, not yet old, living a life that had settled into patterns that would carry her to the end of her days. She thought of Thomas Weldon rarely now, though he had never been entirely forgotten. The letters she had kept in her locked drawer remained there, unread for years but preserved, as if their physical existence maintained some connection to the man who had written them. She had never married again, had received no other proposals, had long since accepted that her life would be lived in this quiet, respectable, and fundamentally lonely way. Inspector Rawlings retired in 1920 and died in 1923, taking with him whatever theories and suspicions he had maintained about Thomas Weldon's disappearance. His successor had no particular interest in old cases, and no time to pursue them even if interest had existed. The file on Thomas Weldon was archived, moved to storage, eventually transferred to a warehouse where records were kept against the unlikely possibility that someone might someday require them. The physical evidence, the bicycle and satchel, were retained for some years, and then, during a reorganisation of the evidence room in the late 1920s, disposed of as no longer necessary to retain. The bicycle was likely sold as scrap metal. The satchel and its contents were probably destroyed. The material traces of Thomas Weldon's existence and disappearance were systematically eliminated by the mundane processes of bureaucratic efficiency. The story, however, persisted in attenuated form. It became one of those local tales that older residents knew and younger residents had heard about vaguely. a piece of canal folklore that existed alongside stories of other disappearances, other mysteries, other unexplained events that had occurred along the waterway over the decades and centuries of its existence. The specifics faded, the exact date, the details of the investigation, the names of those involved, but the essential narrative remained. A man had vanished. His bicycle had been found. His body had never been recovered. The canal had kept it secret. This story, stripped of detail and context, achieved a kind of universality that made it adaptable to different tellings and different purposes. By the 30s, when economic depression had further reduced the canal's commercial viability, and many sections were considered for closure, the story of Thomas Weldon had become thoroughly mythologized. He was the ghost of the Oxfordshire Canal in some versions, a spectral figure who walked the towpath on foggy nights. He was the lost lover in other versions, a man who had died trying to reach the woman he loved. He was the victim of foul play in still other versions, murdered by persons unknown for reasons that had died with him. Each version preserved some element of the original facts, but elaborated them into narrative forms that served the emotional and psychological needs of the tellers, rather than historical accuracy. The actual Thomas Weldon, the printer from Oxford who had struggled with his failing business, who had corresponded with a widow in London, who had walked along a canal on a November morning in 1908, was lost beneath these layers of story and interpretation. The man himself, with his particular thoughts and feelings, his specific motivations and fears, his individual existence had become irrecoverable. Even if evidence emerged that definitively explained what had happened to him, it could not restore him as a complete human being. Too much time had passed. Too many people who had known him had died. The context in which he had lived and disappeared had been transformed by war and social change beyond recognition. Thomas Weldon had become, in the end, not a person, but a symbol, a placeholder for all the unexplained disappearances and unanswered questions that haunted human existence. The Second World War brought new changes to the canal. Some sections were used for industrial transport supporting the war effort. Other sections were abandoned entirely. Young men and women who might never have seen a canal in peacetime found themselves working on narrowboats, maintaining locks, keeping the waterway functional despite shortages of labour and materials. Some of these wartime workers heard the story of Thomas Weldon and added their own interpretations, connecting his disappearance to the general atmosphere of loss and absence that characterized the war years. Everyone, it seemed, was missing someone. Thomas Weldon was simply one name among millions, his individual tragedy absorbed into the collective tragedy of a civilization that had learned to accept death and disappearance as normal conditions of existence. By the 1950s, the Oxfordshire Canal was in serious decline. Much of it had been neglected during the war and had not been restored afterward. Commercial traffic had almost entirely ceased, superseded by rail and road transport. There was serious discussion of filling in sections of the canal and converting them to other uses. The lock cottages, many of them now vacant, fell into disrepair. The towpaths became overgrown. The water, no longer regularly maintained, grew thick with weed and debris. The canal was dying slowly but unmistakably, and with it died much of the living memory and tradition that had made it a distinct cultural space. George Pritchard died in 1952 at the age of 78, one of the last of the old-style lock keepers who had worked the canal their entire lives. He had spent 40 years at Kidlington Lock, had seen the canal's golden age and its decline, had witnessed changes that would have been unimaginable to him as a young man. His death removed one of the last direct connections to the Thomas Weldon case. There were still a few elderly people who remembered the disappearance, but their memories had been shaped by decades of retelling and reinterpretation, and it was no longer possible to separate what they genuinely remembered from what they had learned from stories told by others. Catherine Ashford died in 1957 in London, the age of 87. She had lived alone in her Bloomsbury townhouse to the end, maintaining her boarders until age made the work impossible, then living on a small pension supplemented by the sale of furniture and possessions accumulated to what was over a lifetime. She left no family. She and Harold had never had children, and her relatives had long since died or moved away. Her estate was settled by solicitors who found among her papers a locked box containing letters dated from 1908, written in a masculine hand, addressed to her from a man named Thomas Weldon. The solicitors, having no reason to connect these letters to a disappearance that had occurred nearly 50 years earlier, destroyed them along with other personal papers that had no obvious value or significance. The last direct link between Thomas and Catherine was severed. The canal preservation movement that began in the 1960s and gained momentum through the 70s brought new life to parts of the Oxfordshire Canal. Volunteers worked to restore locks, clear towpaths, and make sections of the waterway navigable again for recreational, rather than commercial purposes. The canal was reimagined as heritage, as a link to England's industrial past, as a scenic amenity for walkers and boaters seeking leisure rather than livelihood. This transformation saved the canal from complete obliteration, but it also completed its transformation from working waterway to museum piece, from living system to preserved artifact. The new generation of canal enthusiasts who walked the towpaths and navigated the locks in their pleasure boats sometimes heard stories about the canal's past, including the story of Thomas Weldon's disappearance. But these stories had by now been reduced to their barest elements: a man vanished, a bicycle found, mystery never solved, and even these elements were often garbled or confused with other stories from other times and places. The specific character of the case, its particular details and circumstances, had been eroded by time and retelling until only a ghost of the original event remained. Modern investigators, amateur historians, and true crime enthusiasts occasionally rediscovered the Thomas Weldon case, usually by accident while researching other matters in old newspaper archives or police records. These rediscoveries sometimes led to renewed speculation, to theories constructed from the limited evidence that remained accessible, to articles or blog posts or local history pamphlets that attempted to solve the mystery using contemporary investigative techniques or psychological insights. Some argued that Thomas had staged his disappearance to escape his debts and had begun a new life elsewhere. Others maintained that he had been murdered, probably by someone connected to Mrs. Ashford, though no evidence supported this theory. Still others suggested suicide, pointing to the stress of his failing business and the uncertainties of his planned move to London as sufficient motive for self-destruction. None of these modern theories could be proven or disproven. The physical evidence no longer existed. The witnesses were dead. The landscape had changed. The canal had been dredged and restored, the banks reinforced, the towpath improved. The exact spot where Thomas's bicycle had been found could no longer be determined with certainty. The willows that had caught the bicycle in their roots had died and been replaced by other trees. The lock cottage where George Pritchard had lived had been demolished and rebuilt. Even the water itself, though flowing through the same channel, was not the same water that had flowed there in 1908. Everything had been replaced or renewed, transformed, until nothing remained of the original scene except the stories people told about what had happened there. The canal flowed on, patient and dark, carrying its reduced traffic of pleasure boats and canoes, flanked now by improved footpaths where walkers and cyclists moved without thought of the dangers that had once attended solitary travel along these banks. The landscape had been domesticated, made safe, incorporated into a network of heritage trails and recreational amenities. The mystery of Thomas Weldon's disappearance, if people thought of it at all, seemed to belong to a different world, a darker England where people could still vanish without explanation, where canals were working places of isolation and danger rather than pleasant venues for weekend leisure. Yet sometimes, usually in autumn when the mist rose from the water and the light failed early, the canal reclaimed something of its old character. The pleasure boats were moored for the season. The towpaths emptied of walkers. The locks fell silent. And in that silence, in that seasonal return to darkness and isolation, it was possible to imagine the canal as it had been in 1908. A working waterway far from any city, a place where a man might walk alone on a November morning, and where that walk might end in ways that left no trace, no explanation, no resolution. The mystery of Thomas Weldon's disappearance had never been solved. It would never be solved. The canal, flowing dark and patient through the English countryside, had kept its secret for over a century and would keep it forever, testament to the fact that some questions, once swallowed by time and water, remain forever beyond the reach of answers. The story ended as it had begun, in silence, in darkness, in the patient flow of water that acknowledged nothing and revealed nothing and simply continued, as it had always continued, as it would continue long after everyone who had ever known or heard of Thomas Weldon had passed from memory into oblivion. The canal remained, the mystery remained, and in the space between what was known and what could never be known, the ghost of a vanished printer walked still, forever approaching a destination he would never reach, forever disappearing into the November mist along a towpath that led nowhere and everywhere, and into the dark heart of the unknowable itself. The night is quiet now. The canal sleeps beneath winter stars, and we, who have walked beside it through this long telling, must release our hold on Thomas Weldon and let him rest in whatever peace the water grants. His story has been told as completely as the fragments of time allow. The mystery endures not because the truth is hidden, but because the truth was never recorded, was witnessed only by the silent canal and the indifferent sky. Some stories have no endings, only the slow fade into silence that comes when all who remember have themselves been forgotten. This is such a story. This is how mysteries survive, not by being solved, but by being released into the darkness, where they belong, where they wait, where they whisper still to those who walk past on foggy evenings and feel, for just a moment, that they are not alone. Sleep well.